following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ralph Tyko with the Comfortably Zoned Network, and I would like to introduce when the Jints and Them Bums played in New York with Noel Hynd and yours truly, Ralph Tyko. Noel, how are you, sir?
Well, I'm fine. I'm glad we're not on television this morning because I'm having dental work and I got something missing up front. I'm looking a little like a street guy from Brooklyn right now, but fortunately it'll all be fixed up soon. Well, if you've had dental work,
you not only have something missing up front, you have something missing from your wallet.
Yeah, I got lucky with the insurance coverage, but it's not too much different from playing hockey, which I played for a while. You lose a tooth here or there. You just have to get them back in eventually. Go ahead.
I'd like to tell our audii why we are both uniquely qualified for this podcast. Noel is an author, and I guess your signature work is a book about the Polo Grounds in New York. And I, too, am a fanatical New York Giant fan, and I go back to when they played there, as does Noel, and we both have a love of the game and a respect for the Giants' opponents in those days, them bums, the Dodgers. Without that rivalry, which we hope to chronicle over the weeks, months, and hopefully years of doing this. Without that rivalry, either of those two teams are diminished, and we're going to have a great time with this. I'll ask you, what was the first game you attended at either the Polo Grounds or Ebbets Field?
Well, the first game I attended at that involved either of the two teams was in 1956, and as I've mentioned in some of our previous discussions, I was a big Stan Musial fan when I was a kid. I liked the Giants, but Musial was my favorite player. My father and I would watch TV on a big Philco in Connecticut, and I wanted to see Musial play, and my father wanted to go to the Polo Grounds. So it was June of 1956. I was just out of fourth grade for the year, and we drove and got lost, naturally, driving in from Connecticut to go see the Cardinals play the Giants. I believe Tom Paholski pitched for the Cardinals. I forget who pitched for the Giants, but I do remember that the Cardinals won 6-0. There were rain delays. My father said, "Oh, this is great. You get to see them put the tarpaulin on the field." I wasn't nearly as amused about seeing the tarp put on the field, but nonetheless we did. Right. And Musial, of course, hit a home run since, he just had to since I was there.
For the first time ever, yes, that broke you as a fan.
Yeah.
What about Musial as a kid, from a kid's standpoint, appealed to you? If you could put yourself in the position of being an 8-year-old or whatever age you were.
Interesting question. I've never really been able to figure out exactly what it was, but there was something. First of all, he was a very dependable player. So, you'd watch Musial, and how long was Stan Musial ever in a slump? So, he was a consistent guy. My father gave me the background on Musial, and of course, nobody had a bad thing to say about Musial. He was not only a great player, but really a fine human being. So I think that kind of came through, and I also think I was attracted by kind of the whimsical nature of the two birds sitting on the baseball bat on the uniform. So it all kind of came together. And of course, Musial couldn't come to New York without being on a hitting spree. I mean, back then if the Cardinals came to New York, they played both teams. So that meant you got, and of course there were only 8 teams in the league. So that meant you got 44 Cardinal games a year involving the Giants and the Dodgers. So frequently the Cardinals would come in, as would any other team, maybe on a Monday or a Tuesday. They would play a series often in the Polo Grounds first and then the weekend at Ebbets Field. So it really had, following a team like that, you really had kind of a window to see them play day to day and to really get a feel of the team. So outstanding player. The Cardinals were not a great team back then. They were sort of lower first division, but good enough to beat up on the Giants, and then not quite good enough to beat up on the Dodgers, who really had a better team in the mid 1950s.
Wow, great answer, Noel. The joy and the just the unabashed love of the game that we National Leaguers who followed either or the Giants and Dodgers was absolutely taken from us in a way. So if the audience listens to your description of how great it was to be a baseball fan in New York until 1957, when they left, you can see that the loss, you can feel the loss that kids like us must have felt. I'm talking to the audience now. So you'll get to hear from us the joy and, the bad stuff about losing the team. I will ask you where you were when you found out that there would no longer be the Giants in the Polo Grounds.
Well, all those horrible stories were spreading pretty rapidly in 1957, but I was 10 years old at the time, and I was a kid, and I didn't have, obviously, an adult's perspective on it, but it almost seemed unreal. It was almost like a friend or a member of the family was going to move away, and you weren't really going to see them close up again.
Right.
You have to realize that unlike any other section of the United States back then, we had 3 teams in New York, and all of them were very, very generously on television. The template was that the Dodgers played about maybe 120 games a year on Channel 9. The Yankees played maybe about 110 on Channel 11, and the New York Giants played every home game on television. So you had, like, on a typical day, there were at least two games to choose from. What was unusual was like a Monday when there was no game or something. And I'll footnote that by saying you then turn on the radio and you had Les Kiter doing a reconstructed game from Chicago or something like that, with that hokey thing of the ball hitting the bat and everything. However,
Did he do that before the Giants moved for other games? I didn't know that. I know he did a recreation when the Giants moved to San Francisco. He did a recreation of their games just like that, with the ball hitting the bat and bang.
Yes, but the template for that was, I think it was WMCA radio, which was down on the far left of the dial. I don't mean that politically, but I mean in terms of the numbers.
Right.
Although they did have Barry Gray, now that I think of it.
I was just going to say, Barry Gray. Along the years we were listening to Long John, Barry Gray, we got some great, Gene Shepard. We got some great radio back then.
Absolutely. But to circle back to baseball, I think what was done was, if there was no New York game on the radio, one of those stations, and it might have been WMCA, would have a reconstructed game, usually a day game from Chicago. And that was, I think, the origin of the idea to do the Giants reconstructed games from San Francisco after 1957?
Noel, the name of the game is Learning, and I'm learning from you. So that's beautiful.
As you know, I know everything, and the rest I make up. So go ahead.
Hey, I just so the audience gets to know you a little bit. We've talked about your dad on podcasts that you've been a guest on. One of the most interesting men going. Talk about your dad and how you got into writing and how you wrote under his name for a while. Very interesting stuff.
Well, my father was I'll try to put it into a minute or two. My father was from Trenton, New Jersey, and never finished high school, and somehow landed in Boston in 1919 or 1920, got hired as a reporter by the Boston Post, which was was an afternoon newspaper and the biggest paper in New England at the time. And he walked into the Post looking for a job, and one of the editors said, "What do you want to do, kid?" And he said, "Write stories." So as I was told, he was handed a pencil, a pad, and they said, "Go find stories. If you don't find anything, don't come back." And, he somehow managed to get he started following the police around to see what they were doing. And one of the first weeks he was there, the cops allowed him to walk into a crime scene. I think it was a murder in the South End. Somebody had come in and found his wife in bed with somebody else, cut the guy's throat, and the cops just said, "Stand in the corner while we question people." He stood in the corner so long that his feet stuck to the floor from the blood that was on the floor. But then he left. He went back and he had the story, and they printed it, and that enabled him to get hired for a second week. To flash forward, a few weeks later, the Ponzi case broke in Boston, the original Charlie Ponzi, and every reporter on the paper got sent to cover that case, and somehow my father got an interview with Ponzi because he found out about where the bar was that Ponzi was working out of. So then he came back and he had an interview with Ponzi to beat a lot of the older people on the paper, with a scoop. And from that time on, he was a crime writer in Boston, later moved to Philadelphia, New York, covered the Lindbergh kidnapping, covered the great outlaws like Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd, Machine Gun Kelly in the 1940s, started to write about espionage also in the 40s. And then eventually when he got older, I started to pick up on some of his true crime work and write some of it under his name and then under my name. And then eventually I got a book published. So what can I say? I went into the family business.
What are the differences in your styles? If someone with an ability an editor, for instance, what would an editor say about your styles?
Interesting question. My father, basically his career ended toward the 1960s. So his style was a little more tabloidish from the day, a little slangier, because he basically made his living out of writing for True Detective, True Magazine, Saturday Evening Post. So it was a little more punch in the face, the type of stuff that you'd expect from a guy sitting at the end of the bar who was streetwise but never finished high school. Because he never finished high school, I got sent to some extremely good schools. How I got in is a mystery to this day to me, but somehow I did. So my style is probably a bit more refined.
You're a little more modest. Let's say you're a little bit more modest.
Maybe, perhaps.
Okay.
And I've had a better formal education, so I'm able to draw on more historical knowledge. And of course, writing in the age of the internet, if you don't know something, you can just go find it. Whereas, of course, he had to call people or go to distant libraries and things like that. The biggest difference probably is mostly I write fiction, and almost exclusively he wrote nonfiction. So there's probably the biggest difference right there.
Noel, were any of his friends journalists whose names we may recognize?
Maybe.
Okay.
One of his best friends was a guy named Ken Purdy, who was an editor at True Magazine for a long time. And in his lifetime, Ken Purdy was one of the experts on motor cars and the automobile industry in the United States. And Ken, last name was spelled Purdy, and you can still find some of his material if you Google him.
Okay.
Purdy made a very interesting career decision along about 1960. He was an contributing editor at True Magazine, and this guy from Chicago said, "Hey, I'm starting up a magazine. I need a car guy. I really like your work. Would you be interested in writing for us? We also publish a lot of pictures of women in a state of undress, if that's a nice enough way to say it."
I think I might know Mr. Hefner's work.
Yeah, we've all thumbed through from time to time.
And that's why his name is recognizable to me. When
yes,
you said it, I couldn't.
Yeah, Purdy was the car guy for Playboy for the rest of his life, and wrote some really great stuff on classic cars and American cars, on foreign cars.
Wow.
He also, my father was a very close friend of a producer named Michael Todd. Mike Todd, does that name ring a bell to you?
I think he might have married Elizabeth Taylor.
He did indeed, and was married to her when he died, as a matter of fact.
Oh, really?
Todd was,
They produced, I think she left, who did she leave? The Jewish singer, Eddie Fisher, for Mike Todd.
No, Fisher came afterwards, and Burton came after Fisher. I'm blanking on the guy's name, but there was a...
Whoops. Did I lose you? You know what? Time for station identification. It's the Comfortably Zoned Network. We'll be back with Mr. Noel Hynd. It's the first episode of when the Jints and the Bums played in New York. So I'm going to be back with you. We'll get a little bumper music. And we'll be back in a moment. Hang tight.